Back in the winter of 2026, what started as just another forecast, well, it turned into a full-blown continental crisis. And I'm not talking about just another storm. No, this was a paralysis event, really on a scale we had never seen before. So today, we're going to open up the archives on what's now called the Great Arctic Incursion. We'll break down the science, the absolutely devastating impact, and most importantly, the survival lessons that, let's be honest, are more critical today than they've ever been.
So, at the absolute peak of this thing, how many people were under a winter weather alert? 230 million. Just let that number sink in for a second. It's almost impossible to wrap your head around, right? We're talking about a nation completely on the brink.
And to put that number into perspective for you, that's roughly 2/3 of the entire US population. Just picture it. From the Rocky Mountains all the way to the Atlantic coast, almost everyone was bracing for impact at the exact same time. This was, without a doubt, a weather event of historic, truly epic proportions. Yeah, and the cost, wow. It wasn't just measured in inches of ice or snow. The financial toll was absolutely staggering. We're talking an estimated $115 billion in economic losses.
Think about that. A single weather event, just one atmospheric disturbance, was powerful enough to cripple the nation's entire Q1 GDP. It was a brutal, brutal lesson in just how fast a weather problem can spiral into a full-blown economic catastrophe. So, the big question is, how on earth does something like this even happen? Well, the answer is way, way up there, about 30 miles above the North Pole. It turns out a really fundamental piece of our planet's atmospheric machinery. It just broke. Okay, so we've all heard the term polar vortex thrown around, right? The best way to think about it, honestly, is like a lid on a giant pot. And inside that pot is the coldest air on the entire planet. Normally, you've got this tight ring of super strong winds way up high, and they act like a perfect lid, keeping all that freezing air locked up right over the Arctic. But then came January 2026. What happened was something called a Sudden Stratospheric Warming event, or SSW. Suddenly, temperatures way, way up in the stratosphere spiked. We're talking over 50 degrees Celsius in just a few days. Now, that heat didn't warm us down here on the ground. Instead, it was like a hammer blow from above that just shattered the lid. And this is where it gets really fascinating. You can see here how these three different systems work together to create the absolute perfect storm. It all started with those Rossby waves. They were the trigger. They broke way up high in the stratosphere, causing that sudden warming we just talked about. That, in turn, led to the main event, the polar vortex itself getting displaced and literally splitting apart. And finally, the jet stream. Well, it became the delivery service. It got super wavy and just funneled all of that Arctic air. I mean, Siberian-grade cold deep, deep into North America. Okay, so now that we've got the science down, let's talk about the chaos this whole thing unleashed on the ground. This is the story of how an entire nation was brought to a dead stop. The storm itself, which they officially named Fern, it just evolved with terrifying speed. Let's just walk through this timeline together. On January 22nd and 23rd, it starts out as just some freezing rain in Texas and Oklahoma. No big deal, right? Wrong. By the 24th, it undergoes what they call explosive intensification, becoming a crippling ice storm across the south. And then, just 2 days later, on the 26th, it's already reformed into a monster nor'easter off the coast of New England. The sheer speed of this escalation, it caught millions of people completely off guard. And what followed was just this cascading failure. It was a domino effect. It all started with the power grid. That was the first and biggest domino to fall. That failure directly led to a total collapse in transportation. You can't run traffic lights or fuel pumps without power. And that, in turn, triggered a massive public health crisis because first responders were stuck. Emergency services, they just couldn't get to people who needed help. And here's the really crucial part, especially for the Deep South. It didn't take some massive movie-style blizzard to break the entire system. All it took was 1 inch. Just 1 inch of ice building up on power lines and trees. That sheer weight was enough to snap utility poles like toothpicks and plunge millions of people into a freezing, terrifying darkness that lasted for days. I mean, the National Transportation Network, it pretty much just stopped existing for a while. In total, more than 26,000 flights were canceled. That's not just stranded travelers. That's critical supplies, medicines, food, everything paralyzed.
So you look at all the chaos of 2026, and what's left is this brutal but really clear playbook. It taught us two huge lessons. One, our modern infrastructure is way more fragile than we like to think. And two, personal preparedness isn't just a nice idea, it's completely non-negotiable. So let's get into the survival manual that was born from this crisis. This event really shined a spotlight on the unique vulnerabilities of two groups in particular. First, you have apartment dwellers, right? You're totally dependent on building-wide systems for heat and power that you have no control over. And second, electric vehicle drivers. All that cutting-edge tech suddenly came face-to-face with an ancient enemy, just plain brutal cold. Okay, so if you live in an apartment, your survival manual is all about tactics. Step one is the tissue test. It's super simple. Just hold a tissue near your window frames and doors. If it flickers, you've got a thermal breach. You're losing heat. Step two, seal that breach right away. Rolled up towels, painter's tape, whatever works. And step three, and this one is absolutely crucial, protect your pipes. Open up those cabinets under your sinks to let the warm air in and let your faucets drip just a tiny pencil-thin stream. That little bit of moving water can be the difference between a normal night and a catastrophic flood from a burst pipe. All right, now for all you EV drivers out there, your protocol is all about one thing, preserving energy. First things first, precondition your car while it's still plugged in. That warms up the battery and the cabin using power from the grid, not from your precious range. Then, when you're on the road, use focused heating. Your heated seats and steering wheel use way less energy than cranking the main cabin heater. And finally, engage eco mode. It's essential. It limits that jackrabbit acceleration and helps you squeeze every single last mile out of a battery that's struggling in the cold. And this chart, this shows you exactly why those steps are so critical. Look, that full bar, that's your car's normal advertised range. That shorter bar, that's your reality in sub-zero weather. You could see a range loss of up to 40%. That means your car that's supposed to get 300 miles on a charge suddenly struggles to even get 180. And in an emergency situation, that's not an inconvenience. That's a potentially life-threatening difference. But here's the thing. Just because Winter Storm Fern finally dissipated, that didn't mean the crisis was over. Not by a long shot. The atmospheric pattern that created it in the first place, that broken Arctic lid we talked about, was still just sitting there, locked in place right over North America. In fact, while the whole country was still trying to dig out, forecasters were already tracking the next monster storm. They called it Winter Storm Gianna, and it had all the telltale signs of becoming a bomb cyclone that was ready to hammer the entire East Coast all over again. The analysis at the time used this really chilling phrase. They said a second wave of stratospheric warming could keep the Arctic gates open for the rest of the month. So this wasn't just a one-off storm. It was a sustained siege, a siege of cold that was going to last for weeks. So when you look at everything we've talked about, the grid failures, the transportation collapse, the fact that this was a multi-week event, it all proves why this checklist right here is maybe the most important takeaway of all. Your 72-hour kit, it's not just a nice suggestion from a government website, it is your personal resilience plan for when every other system out there fails you. Look, the Great Arctic Incursion was a brutal test, but its lessons couldn't be clearer. Our modern world is fragile, and self-reliance is simply not optional anymore. That event left us with a proven manual for resilience. So the only real question left is, are you actually prepared to use it?